On the night of the 6th of May, 1910, as King Edward VII lay dying in a stuffy bedroom at Buckingham Palace, his valet leaned close and caught 3 faint words meant for someone in particular. Tell her, I am sorry, and for more than 100 years, no one has been able to say for certain who she was. Here is what those in the room described. The king was drifting, awake one moment and gone the next, his breathing shallow, the air thick and warm. Doctors came and went. Family stood close, and somewhere in that fog of half-sleep, the man who had dressed him and shaved him and known his moods for years bent down to the pillow, and the king spoke, not a speech, not a farewell to the nation. 3 words, low and private, aimed at one person he did not name. He died just before midnight. Before you decide who you think she was, hold that guess, because by the end it may not survive. The obvious answer is his wife. Queen Alexandra had stood beside this man for nearly 50 years, and if a dying king apologises to a woman, surely it is the woman he married. That is the clean answer. It is the one the palace was happy for people to reach. But the staff who were there, and the biographers who came after, hint at something more tangled, and once you see the shape of Edward's life, the apology stops being simple and starts being a question that will not sit still. So who was he, this man on the bed? He was old to be a new king. Edward came to the throne at 59, an age when most men are winding down, not starting the one job they were born for. He had waited his entire life for it. Before we get to those final regrets and the son he left behind, one quick thing. If you're the kind of person who leans in for stories like this, the whispered version history tried to tidy up, this channel is built for you. That's the whole promise here. The messy, human account underneath the official record. So if this one's pulled you in, hit subscribe and ring the bell, and the next one comes to you. Now, back to Edward, and the regrets he carried far beyond that stuffy bedroom. His mother, Queen Victoria, had reigned, and reigned, and reigned, and while she did, her eldest son sat having a kind of gilded waiting room with nothing real to do. The public knew a certain Edward, portly, bearded, fond of a good cigar and a better dinner, a man who loved horses and the roar of a racecourse, who dressed impeccably and dined enormously and enjoyed the company of women rather more than a married king perhaps should. That was the image, a pleasure-loving prince who grew into a pleasure-loving monarch, genial, greedy, and to most eyes, harmless. The private story is colder, and it starts with his mother. Victoria never forgave him. In 1861, his father, Prince Albert, died young, and the grieving queen fixed the blame on her son. Edward, then a young man, had been caught up in a small scandal with an actress, and Albert had travelled in poor weather to deal with it not long before he fell ill. In Victoria's mind, the two things fused. She decided, unfairly, that the worry had helped kill his father. She could barely look at him afterwards. She called him frivolous. She thought him weak, and she made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. She kept him out. Think about what that means for a man. The heir to the greatest empire on earth, and his own mother would not trust him with the papers, the meetings, the real work of the crown. For decades she held the door shut. No serious responsibility, no proper role, just the waiting and the watching, and the slow understanding that the only throne he would ever get was the one he could not touch until she was gone. Picture the room years later. A king kept from power his whole life. Now, with only hours of it left, a man given nothing to do will find something to do. And Edward did. If the palace would not hand him duty, he built a life out of everything else. The shooting parties on great country estates, the guns and the beaters, and the long autumn days, the racecourse, where his horses ran under his own colours, and the crowds cheered a prince who actually turned up, the card tables, the yachts, the long dinners that ran to 10 and 12 courses, and the women, a long line of them discreetly managed, quietly paid for in reputation, and fought over behind the scenes by a household forever trying to keep the names out of the drawing rooms and out of the newspapers. This is the gap the whole story turns on. In public, a jolly, harmless king. In private, a man who had been told his whole life that he did not matter, and who spent that life proving, in the only arena left open to him, that he did. The crown Edward wore in his final years was real, but the man underneath had been shaped decades earlier by a door his own mother had held shut, which brings us to the marriage. In 1863, still Prince of Wales and not yet 30, Edward married a Danish princess named Alexandra. She was beautiful, gentle, a little deaf, and genuinely liked by the public from the moment she arrived. On paper, it was a fairy tale. In practice, it was something more complicated. There was real affection between them, that much friends of the household never doubted. But wrapped around that affection was a quiet betrayal that would last as long as the marriage did. Because Alexandra knew. She knew about the women. She knew the names that circulated in society, the mistresses the family worked so hard to hide, and she never once made a public scene about a single one of them. Not a raised voice the papers could print, not a scandal she handed to the world. She endured. Decade after decade, she smiled beside him at the great occasions, gave him children, played the devoted wife the nation adored, and swallowed a private humiliation most people would not survive a single year of. Why would a woman do that? Why tolerate a lifetime of it in silence when she could have made his life a public misery? Hold on to that question, because how Alexandra chose to carry her husband's betrayals is not a footnote to this story. It is the key to the strangest thing she ever did, because here is what the clean answer about the deathbed leaves out. Alexandra endured every mistress in silence. Yes, but there was one woman she did not treat like all the rest, one name the family guarded most carefully of all, a companion so woven into the king's daily life that she was welcomed at his own table, seated near him at dinner, folded into the household as though she belonged there. Alexandra tolerated that one more than any of the others, and no one who watched it ever fully understood why. And what Alexandra decided to do about that woman in the last hours of her husband's life, in that stuffy bedroom on the 6th of May, is the single most extraordinary thing anyone in the room would ever witness. The one woman Alexandra treated differently had a name every drawing room in London already knew. Alice Keppel. To understand why that name mattered, you have to see the ones that came before it. For years, Alexandra had watched other women attach themselves to her husband and drift back to her through the gossip of society. There was the actress Lily Langtry, the celebrated beauty of her day, whose face sold prints, and whose name the newspapers half whispered whenever Edward was mentioned. There were others after her, singers, the wives of aristocrats, women glimpsed across a crowded house party and never quite explained. Alexandra knew about all of them. Friends of the household said she always knew, and in all those years, she never once made a public scene. Alice Keppel was not that kind of story. She was not a passing fancy or a single season's scandal. She was his companion for the last 12 years of his life, and she held that place the way no one before her had ever managed. Clever, warm, and discreet in exactly the spots where the others had been careless, she knew how to sit at a royal table and make herself easy company for every person seated at it, including, somehow, the Queen. Alexandra tolerated her more than any woman who came before, and that is the detail biographers keep returning to. Of all the mistresses, the one the wife could bear was the one who stayed the longest. There was a kind of quiet genius to how she managed it. She never asked Edward for anything he could not comfortably give. She smoothed his moods, laughed in the right places, and knew, always, when to make herself invisible. Politicians learned that a word placed with her could reach the king more gently than through any official channel. She was welcomed at his table not as a secret hidden away in a back room, but as a guest, seated in plain view, part of the furniture of his life. And Alexandra, who had every reason in the world to hate her, somehow did not. By the first week of May, 1910, the arrangement that had held for over a decade was running out of time. The king's health had been failing through the winter. He was short of breath, his heart labouring under the weight he had never learned to carry lightly. His doctors stopped offering comfort and started telling the truth. Word went out quietly to the people who needed to know. In the corridors of Buckingham Palace, the household gathered outside the bedroom, attendants standing in the hush that falls when everyone understands what is coming, and no one is willing to say it. There is a detail from that last day that tells you almost everything about him. That afternoon, one of his horses won a race at Kempton Park, and someone carried the result up to the sick room. The dying king, told his colt had come in first, is reported to have answered only that he was very glad. Then he collapsed again. He refused, for as long as his body allowed it, to go to bed and give in. The Queen was there. The son who would inherit the throne was there. And then Alexandra did the thing that no one who heard of it ever managed to forget. According to accounts passed down from those in the room, the Queen herself sent for Alice Keppel. She sent for the mistress. She had the other woman brought into her own house, to the bedside of her own dying husband, with her own family standing around it. Read that again. The wife sent for the mistress. Ask yourself, honestly, whether you could have done it. There are two ways to read what she did, and biographers have argued over both of them for more than 100 years. The first is that it was an act of astonishing dignity, a wife lifted so far above ordinary jealousy that she could hand a dying man the face he wanted at the very end, and let him go without denying him a single thing, even this one. The second reading is colder, and some historians think it is the honest one. After 40 years of swallowing her humiliation in silence, Alexandra was at last completely in command of the room. The king belonged to her now. The deathbed belonged to her. And sending for Keppel was not surrender. It was the final word in a long marriage full of unspoken ones, delivered in the one place the mistress could not pretend she had not heard it. Whatever Alexandra meant by it, the scene did not hold together. Keppel became distressed and was led away from the bedside. The accounts differ on how far it went. Some say her composure simply cracked, that the calm which had carried her for 12 years failed her at the worst possible moment, in front of the entire household. Whatever the exact shape of it, the woman who had always known precisely how to behave in a royal room no longer did. She was taken out, and the door closed behind her, and this is where the king's 3 words turn in the light and show a second face. Tell her, I am sorry. When he murmured them, the wife who had endured everything stood on one side of him, and the companion of 12 years was being pulled from him on the other. So now the apology has 2 possible owners. Which one is yours? Was that her, Alexandra, the woman he had wounded quietly for 4 decades and never once apologised to out loud? Or was it Keppel, torn from the room in tears, the whole private world he had built for himself collapsing in real time, while the public king died in front of an audience? He never said the name. That is the whole cruelty of it. One small word, her, left hanging in a room that happened to hold the two women it could most plausibly mean. If he had lived another minute and finished the thought, the question would have died with him, and no one would be arguing about it now. He did not. The pronoun stayed open, and every person in that bedroom carried a different answer out of it. This was the gap Edward had spent his whole reign managing. The distance between the genial, pleasure-loving monarch the country thought it knew, and the far more complicated man behind the palace doors. That gap had never pressed together as tightly as it did in that stuffy bedroom. Two women, one dying king, and a secret held inside a single sentence. But the biographers who have spent their careers inside this story add a warning right here, and it is part of why the whisper has never been settled. The two women may not be the whole answer, because Edward carried other apologies, ones he never spoke aloud to anyone at all. There was one he owed the mother who had distrusted him for 50 years, who blamed him for his father's death and kept him at arm's length from any real work until the day she died. And there was one he may have owed the shy, dutiful son standing just then in the doorway of the room, the man who would become King George V, the man who wept openly the moment his father died, and that son is the part of this story we tend to walk past. George stood in the doorway of that stuffy bedroom and watched his father go, and the men who were there said he wept openly when his father died. No restraint, no royal composure, just a middle-aged man losing his dad. He was not ready. Nobody had made him ready. Within hours he would be King George V, and he would spend the rest of his life doing the careful, dutiful work his father had rarely been trusted with, because that is the wound underneath all of this. Edward waited 59 years for the throne. His mother, Queen Victoria, kept him at arm's length for almost all of them. She had decided, back when he was young, that he was frivolous, that he was soft, that he could not be trusted with anything that mattered. She blamed him, quietly and unfairly, for the death of his father, Prince Albert, and so she gave him nothing to do. No red boxes, no real say. A future king with a lifetime of empty afternoons. So think about what that does to a man over 5 decades. He fills the empty afternoons. Horses, cigars, long dinners. The women. The public looked at that and saw a lazy, pleasure-loving prince, and they were not entirely wrong. But some of the biographers who came later look at the same man and see something sadder underneath the cigars. A son who was told again and again that he was not good enough for the one job he was born to hold. A man who was sorry, maybe, for the years that got wasted while his mother made him wait, for the frivolity she accused him of, for the serious work he was never once allowed to touch. So now the field of regret is a lot wider than one whisper and one woman. There is the wife who swallowed decades of it in silence. There is the companion of his last 12 years, led away from his bedside in tears. There is the mother who cost him half a century of purpose. And there is the boy in the doorway, unprepared, grieving, about to inherit a crown his father never really got to wear. So let us actually weigh them, one at a time. Queen Alexandra is the obvious one, and the obvious one is usually right. A wife who knew about every mistress and never once made a scene in public. A woman who had earned an apology more than anyone alive. If a dying man is going to be sorry to someone, sorry to the person he hurt the longest, makes a terrible kind of sense. Then there is Alice Keppel. She was at the bedside because Alexandra herself had summoned her there. She had been his companion for 12 years, discreet and clever, and welcome at his own table. And she was the one physically torn out of the room in his final hours, distressed enough that they had to lead her away. If his eyes were on the door she left through, the apology was for her. And then there is the possibility nobody wants to sit with, because it is the least satisfying, that the apology was never about a lover at all, that when a man says he is sorry at the very end, the her in his mouth might be the mother who never forgave him, or England herself, the country he was finally handing to a son who wept in a doorway. We assume it was romantic. We assume it was a woman he loved. That assumption may just be us, writing the ending we prefer. Here is where I have to stop you, because it would be easy to keep spinning theories all night. So let us be honest about what is actually on the record and what is not. What is on the record is almost nothing. The palace released a clean, dignified version of the king's death, a calm passing, a monarch surrounded by family. The official notice went out, black-bordered, correct, the kind of thing that gets read aloud in churches and pinned up in shop windows across the empire. That version has a wife at the bedside and a nation in mourning, and not one uncomfortable detail in it. It is the version they wanted the public to keep. It is the public king, managed to the very last. Everything else, the messy human version, survived only in the memories of the handful of people who were actually in that room. The summoned mistress, the weeping wife who had summoned her, the valet leaning close to a fading man, the faint apology that no court document would ever confirm, because it was never meant for a court document. It was meant for one person, spoken so quietly that only the servant closest to the pillow caught it at all. And that is the whole tension of this man, sitting in one bedroom on one night, the tidy official story on one side, the tangled private truth on the other, the exact gap he had spent his entire life managing, holding the public king apart from the private man with both hands, right up until the hands let go. You have heard the evidence now. Every candidate is on the table, and you have been leaning toward one of them for a while. So do this before I tell you what we actually know. Say the name out loud. The wife, the companion, the mother. Whichever her you landed on, name it now. Because here is what we actually know. On the evening of the 6th of May, 1910, in that hot, close bedroom at Buckingham Palace, King Edward VII murmured a few faint words near the end, and his valet was near enough to catch them. Tell her, I am sorry. That is it. That is the whole of it. 3 words that survived 100 years. He never said which her he meant. He did not name her. He did not point. He did not leave a letter or a look that anyone recorded. He said, Tell her, I am sorry. And then he slipped under again, and just before midnight, he was gone. And the one thread that could have tied that apology to a single face went with him. The valet heard the words. The valet did not hear the name, because there was no name. There was only her. And everyone who might have filled in that blank, the valet, Alexandra, Alice Keppel, the son who wept in the doorway, every single person who was breathing in that room that night has been dead for 100 years. The answer did not get lost. It was never written down. It left the world in the mouth of a dying man, and it has stayed left, so we are not going to solve it. I want to be straight with you about that, because a lesser telling would pretend to. It would pick the wife, tie the bow, roll credits. But the honest ending is the unsatisfying one, and the unsatisfying one happens to be the true one. The apology is real. The witness is real. The missing name is permanent. And once you accept that, something turns over, and the ambiguity stops feeling like a hole in the story and starts feeling like the whole point of it. Edward VII spent 59 years, cigars and mistresses and horses, and long silences with his mother, keeping the public king and the private man in 2 separate rooms. The portly, jolly monarch, The crowds cheered. The tangled, guilty, waiting man behind the palace doors. Two versions of one person held apart on purpose for a lifetime. And in his last breath, that gap finally collapsed. The two rooms became one. Everything he had managed to keep hidden and everything he had let the public see met in 3 words that pointed at a woman he would not name. And then it all went quiet. The private man got the last word, and the last word gave nothing away. He kept his secret the way he had kept it all his life, perfectly. 100 years of silence, and the answer died in that room with the man who knew it. So do not let me hand you a tidy solution, because there isn't one, and pretending there is would be a lie he never told. Just sit with the whisper. Sit with the hot bedroom, and the leaning valet, and the wife, and the mistress, and the weeping son, and sit with which her you believe. He never said which her he meant.